So the 21-foot rule is something that most people have heard of, but very few people actually understand. And the most common misconceptions could very well get you killed. So let's get after it. I'm James Merritt, emergency manager and career soldier, and this is Readiness Nation. So even as of last month, people are still posting videos demonstrating that no one actually understands the 21-foot rule. So today we need to talk about what the 21-foot rule actually is, where it comes from, if it's actually legitimate, and what are the important takeaways for you, the responsibly armed citizen. And one last note before we get started. This video was on the production slate for months and wasn't intended to be a reaction video. And it's still mostly not. However, Pewview and the Fed Electrician released a video last month demonstrating some things we definitely need to talk about. But in no way is this intended to be an attack on either of them. They seem like good dudes and I like both of their content. Furthermore, neither one was claiming to be an expert. Fed Electrician just said, "This is some FUD lore I heard and I want to test it." So in part, Nick, this is for you. So first up, where does the 21-foot rule even come from? Well, back in the early 1980s, at that time Sergeant Dennis Tueller of the Salt Lake City PD wanted to know how much standoff an officer needs to be able to draw their weapon and engage a suspect before said suspect could attack them with a knife. The findings from this study were originally published in SWAT magazine in 1983. This study was repeated in 2021 by Dr. William Sandel using modern research methodologies. The experimental design was the same for both studies, and we will cover each study's findings. Tueller's experimental design began with testing a sample of police officers on how long it took them to draw their weapon from the holster on their duty belt and achieve 2 A-zone chest hits. Tueller found an average time of 1.5 seconds, while Sandel's study found an average of 1.8 seconds. Tueller then tested how far an assailant could run in 1.5 seconds, finding an average distance of 21 feet. Though confirming this distance was the first step in Sandel's study, he too found that the average distance the attacker could cover in 1.5 seconds was 21 feet. The third step in both studies was to have a simulated attacker charge an officer from a distance of 21 feet and see which one was able to effectively engage the other first. In Sandel's study, the officers weren't told what was going to happen in the scenario, just that they had to interact with a suspect. Tueller's study found this engagement was essentially a tie, with officers effectively engaging the suspect, but the suspect often able to effectively engage the officer as well. Sandel found that 12% of officers couldn't draw their weapon in time, and 25% of officers who were able to draw their weapon missed the suspect entirely. So is the 21-foot rule FUD lore nonsense? Given the fact that we have 2 studies that came up with very similar findings, we can safely say that it's not nonsense. However, because no one goes back to the studies to fully understand their findings, we can safely say that a lot of people's interpretation of what the 21-foot rule means is nonsense. There are actually several important takeaways here for the responsibly armed citizen. And this is where those rascally Iowa boys will make their appearance. The very first thing you need to keep in mind is that 21 feet was the distance at which there was a tie between gun and knife, not the distance at which you're totally safe. Sandel's study found that officers were stabbed 33% of the time.
It's such a sketchy scenario, because like you said, there's momentum's already at you. Even you landing shots, you're still getting a knife.
The second takeaway is that all the numbers discussed in these studies are averages. Some people run slower or faster, some people draw slower or faster. So even in the context of these studies, 21 feet isn't a hard rule. It's just the average.
What level of training you actually need to be able to shoot somebody with a knife? We're going to go with somebody with very little training, like Calvin. Then we'll go with somebody with intermediate training, such as myself, and then we'll step it all the way up to this guy over here and see if he can shoot you before you can stab him.
So to actually get anything useful out of these studies, you need to stop thinking about it as a generic hard standard and start thinking about yourself and your capabilities as an individual. So based on how you personally carry your weapon, how long does it take you to draw your weapon and achieve 2 A-zone chest hits? Based on the findings of both studies, the average assailant can cover 14 feet per second, or 16.8 inches per tenth of a second. So just take how long it took you to complete that drill in seconds and multiply that number by 168. Then divide that number by 12 to get your personal minimum distance in feet. This exact phenomena was demonstrated in the Pewview video. Now initially they're only firing 1 round and they're using an airsoft gun without the pellets. But in the video, Pewview was able to draw and fire in 1.1 seconds.
Okay.
Dude, that happens so fast. You are like standing there looking at 21 foot. Like, you got that all day. That happens fast.
In that time, an average assailant should have only been able to cover about 15.5 feet. The video shows the assailant still being some feet away, though they didn't measure their remaining distance. The next thing we need to talk about is when Fed Electrician tries the drill. He's able to draw and shoot before getting stabbed, only because he takes several steps backwards while doing so. This is actually very common in videos claiming to debunk the 21-foot rule. But it's the 21-foot rule, not the 30-foot rule. You didn't debunk anything if you took steps backwards.
Yeah, Paul, just the initial, like, look, that was ready.
I was not ready. I was not ready. So big up. Do you imagine smoking somebody like that? And it's just like somebody running up to give you a hug. Like some disabled guy that thinks you're his relative. Like.
However, this is very effective practice in a self-defense scenario. Not only is it demonstrated in the video, but in a fourth phase of testing, Sandel found that the officer only got stabbed 7.7% of the time while taking steps backwards, and only 5.3% of the time when taking steps to the side. This next point is just something for you to consider that steps outside the context of the study. And that's the idea that you probably want to swap out those 2 A-zone chest hits from the study for a full Mozambique drill. If you're an average citizen, no one's trying to assassinate you. So if you ever find yourself in a situation where you're being charged by a person with a melee weapon, that person is probably either mentally ill or on some very hard narcotics. Either way, pain compliance isn't going to stop the assailant. You need to turn their body off. This is precisely why the Mozambique, or failure to stop drill, was developed, because even 2 A-zone chest hits can fail to get the job done. So adding an additional shot to the head should ensure the threat is neutralized no matter how crazy or hopped up they are. The final takeaway we need to discuss is that in interviews since, now retired Lieutenant Tueller has explained that he never intended 21 feet to become a hard rule for safe distances. His intended purpose was to quantify the fact that officers need to maintain standoff to be able to perceive and effectively react to threats. In modern military parlance, we refer to this as the OODA loop. OODA standing for Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act. This is the process that you'll have to go through if you don't know what's happening ahead of time. As previously mentioned, in Sandel's study, the officers weren't told what was going to happen in the scenario. They were just told to interact with the suspect as they would in a real-world situation. Just like in real life, they didn't know they needed to shoot until they observed and were oriented to the threat. To their credit, Pewview and the Fed Electrician realized after the first couple of iterations that it was unrealistic that they were standing there looking at the assailant and ready to shoot when the exercise began. So they did a few iterations where they threw in some distractors.
Do 180, stand over here, and then wait for the sound. Yeah. Oh.
I'll yell knife like I'm your partner as soon as he goes to move.
Okay. Oh, these sweatshirts are more for that dress.
Put your phone in your hands.
All right, there we go.
Texting.
Yeah, fuck.
Yeah, it's true.
And your initial reaction to hearing footsteps isn't going to be pull your gun. It's who the fuck is that? What do they want? Like, right now, I know that I'm pulling my gun. Yeah, that's crazy.
This is actually where the overwhelming majority of self-defense tests and even a lot of self-defense training goes wrong. 3 of the 4 steps in the OODA loop are cognitive, and only 1 is physiological. Yet when people are testing their self-defense concepts, they're only testing the physiological. So of course, when Pewview knows what's going to happen, what he needs to do, he can do it in roughly 2/3 of the time it took the average officer in the study, because 2 steps have been taken out of his OODA loop. And those 2 steps are the 2 most time-consuming steps. So if you really want to understand how quickly and effectively you can actually respond to real-world threats, it's imperative that you're running drills where you don't know what's going to happen until you've observed and are oriented to the threat and have to decide on the course of action to take before you then take it. Otherwise, you're getting an unrealistic gauge of your capabilities as well as an inaccurate understanding of the efficacy of your self-defense strategy and techniques. And overestimating your capabilities in a life and death situation is the most dangerous thing you can do. But that's going to be it for me. So if you found this information useful, give me the old controlled pair on the like and subscribe buttons. And if you found this information useful enough that you want to buy me a beer about it, there's a link to my Patreon in the description. So until next time, this is James Merritt for Readiness Nation, reminding you to always be the master of your fate and the captain of your soul.